The proximity alarm screamed through the cockpit of the UES Defiant as Commander Jake Morrison fought to keep his wounded scout ship from tearing itself apart. Plasma burns scarred the hull where Zephyrian interceptors had raked his vessel with concentrated fire, and the artificial gravity generators flickered sporadically, making his stomach lurch with each fluctuation. "Come on, sweetheart," Morrison muttered to his ship, his calloused hands dancing across the control console as he tried to coax more power from the failing engines. "Don't give up on me now." The Defiant had been his home for 3 years of deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. She was a sleek, fast vessel designed for stealth and evasion rather than direct confrontation. Morrison had pushed her harder than any ship should be pushed, slipping through Zephyrian patrols to gather intelligence on enemy fleet movements and supply lines. Today, his luck had finally run out. Through the cracked view screen, he could see the massive bulk of a Zephyrian dreadnought moving to intercept his escape vector. The alien vessel was a kilometer long, its hull bristling with weapon emplacements and sensor arrays. Compared to his small scout ship, it was like a great white shark closing in on a wounded minnow. Morrison's fingers flew over the communications console, broadcasting an encrypted burst transmission back toward human space. The message contained everything he'd learned about the Zephyrian fleet buildup in the Vega sector, intelligence that could save thousands of human lives if it reached the right people in time. "Message away," he said to himself, then braced for impact as the dreadnought's tractor beam locked onto his ship. The Defiant shuddered violently as the alien beam seized her, dragging the small vessel toward the larger ship's docking bay. Morrison had been in similar situations before. Capture was an occupational hazard for reconnaissance pilots. The key was to stay calm, observe everything, and wait for the right moment to escape. He quickly activated the ship's data purge protocols, watching as terabytes of classified information dissolved into random noise. The Zephyrians would find nothing useful in his computer banks. Morrison then removed his sidearm and the small fusion grenade from his tactical vest, hiding them in a concealed compartment behind the pilot's seat. If he managed to escape later, he'd need weapons. The docking bay doors of the Zephyrian ship yawned open like the maw of some mechanical beast. Morrison felt the familiar knot of fear in his stomach, a fear he'd learned to use rather than fight. Fear kept you alive if you knew how to channel it. The Defiant settled onto the deck with a grinding crash of twisted metal. Through the view screen, Morrison could see Zephyrian Marines forming up around his ship, their reptilian forms moving with predatory grace. They were tall, lean creatures with scaled skin that ranged from deep green to mottled brown. Their eyes were large and golden, adapted for hunting in low light, and their mouths were filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. Morrison had studied the Zephyrian military extensively during his intelligence training. They were disciplined, efficient, and utterly ruthless. Their empire had conquered 17 different species over the past 2 centuries, either absorbing useful populations as slave labor or exterminating those they deemed inferior. Humanity, unfortunately, had been placed in the latter category. The ship's hull groaned as cutting torches began slicing through the airlock. Morrison used the last few seconds to center himself mentally, drawing on years of survival training and combat experience. He was a Titan-born, raised in the crushing gravity of Saturn's largest moon. That gave him certain advantages, though he was careful never to reveal the full extent of those advantages to any enemy. The airlock door exploded inward in a shower of sparks and molten metal. Zephyrian Marines poured through the breach, their plasma rifles trained on Morrison's position. He raised his hands slowly, making no sudden movements that might trigger their predatory instincts. The stun blast hit him square in the chest before he could speak. The weapon's neural disruptor sent cascading waves of agony through his nervous system, and Morrison felt his muscles seize uncontrollably. His vision blurred as he crashed to the deck of his ship, the acrid smell of burned circuits and ozone filling his nostrils. As consciousness faded, the last thing he saw was Subcommander Vextar stepping through the breach. The Zephyrian officer's forked tongue flicked out to taste the air, and his golden eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Morrison had encountered Vextar twice before during the war, and both times the alien had proven himself to be particularly cruel, even by Zephyrian standards. Alive, Vextar hissed to his troops. The High Command wants this one intact for questioning. Darkness claimed Morrison's vision, but his mind remained focused on a single thought. Escape. He'd done it before, and he'd do it again. The Zephyrians might think they had captured just another human pilot, but they had no idea what they were really dealing with. When Morrison next opened his eyes, he found himself in a containment cell aboard the Zephyrian dreadnought. The walls were a dull metallic gray, constructed from the same duranium alloy used throughout Zephyrian military vessels. A force field hummed ominously across the entrance, its blue energy barrier casting eerie shadows on the opposite wall. 3 Zephyrian guards stood outside his cell, their reptilian features twisted in what Morrison had learned to recognize as amusement. They were young, probably fresh from the military academies on Zephyria Prime, eager to prove themselves in humanity's extermination. "Look at the pathetic human," hissed Subcommander Vextar as he approached the cell, his forked tongue flicking between jagged teeth. So small, so weak. How did such feeble creatures ever think they could challenge the Zephyrian Empire? The other guards chittered in their harsh, guttural language, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Morrison remained seated on the metal bench that served as the cell's only furniture, observing them with calm, calculating eyes. He'd been captured before during the war. This wasn't his first time as a prisoner of war. "Tell me, little mammal," Vextar continued, stepping closer to the force field. "How many of your kind did we exterminate at the Battle of Kepler 442? Was it 10,000? 20? Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. The Battle of Kepler 442 had been a massacre that haunted his dreams. An entire human colony, 50,000 civilians including his younger brother's family, wiped out in a matter of hours by orbital bombardment. The Zephyrians had broadcast the slaughter across human space as a warning of what awaited anyone who continued to resist their expansion. But Morrison kept his expression neutral, giving his captors no satisfaction. He would endure whatever they threw at him, just as he had endured the crushing gravity of Titan, the horrors of war, and the loss of everyone he'd ever loved. Endurance was humanity's greatest strength, though the Zephyrians had yet to understand that fundamental truth. Soon, he thought grimly, they would learn. For 3 days, they tried to break him. The Zephyrians were experts at psychological torture, having perfected their techniques on dozens of conquered species over the centuries. Their methods were clinical, efficient, and devastatingly effective against most sentient beings. Unfortunately for them, Jake Morrison wasn't most sentient beings. The interrogation chamber was a sterile white cube, its walls lined with holographic projectors and neural feedback sensors. Morrison sat strapped to a chair in the center, electrodes attached to his temples and wrists. The restraints were made of the same duranium alloy as his cell, designed to hold creatures far stronger than baseline humans. They would have been more than adequate for any other prisoner the Zephyrians had encountered. Subcommander Vextar circled him like a predator, his golden eyes gleaming with malicious intelligence. The reptilian officer had changed from his military uniform into the black robes of a Zephyrian interrogator, complete with the ceremonial bone talismans that marked his expertise in breaking minds. "Let us begin again, Commander Morrison," Vextar hissed, his forked tongue tasting the air for chemical traces of fear. "Tell me about the human fleet dispositions in the Centauri sector." Morrison stared straight ahead, his breathing steady and controlled. He'd endured worse than this during his survival training on Titan. The interrogators there had been human instructors who understood exactly how to push a Titanborn to his limits. This alien's crude attempts at intimidation were almost quaint by comparison. When Morrison remained silent, Vextar activated the holographic projectors. The white walls disappeared, replaced by scenes of horror that made Morrison's stomach clench with rage. Human colonies burning under orbital bombardment. Civilians fleeing in terror as plasma beams turned their cities to molten glass. Children crying over the bodies of their parents. "Your species is finished?" Vextar sneered, manipulating the holograms to show even more graphic scenes of destruction. "We have located your homeworld. Earth will burn just like the others. Your friends, your family, everyone you've ever known. All of them will die screaming unless you cooperate. Morrison's hands tightened slightly against the restraints, but his expression never changed. The Zephyrian noticed the subtle reaction and leaned closer. His reptilian features twisted with satisfaction. "Ah, there it is," Vextar whispered. "The first crack in your primitive mammalian composure. Tell me, Commander, do you have family on Earth? A mate? Offspring? Perhaps elderly parents who raised you?" The holographic display shifted to show surveillance footage of Earth's major cities: New York, London, Tokyo, Lagos. Millions of humans going about their daily lives, unaware that an alien fleet was plotting their extinction. Morrison had to use every ounce of his training to keep his face neutral. But inside, he was cataloging everything. The layout of the interrogation chamber, the guard rotations he'd observed during his transfer from the cell, the way Vextar favored his left side, suggesting an old injury, the location of weapons lockers he'd glimpsed in the corridors. Morrison's mind worked like a tactical computer, processing every detail that might prove useful later. On the second day, they brought in Chief Science Officer Youthgal to examine their prize specimen. Unlike the crude soldiers, she was clinical in her approach, treating Morrison like a particularly interesting laboratory animal. Her scaled hands were steady as she ran various scanners over his body, collecting data on human physiology. "Fascinating," she mused, studying the readings on her instruments. "Such dense bone structure and these muscle fibers. Most peculiar. The cardiovascular system is remarkably efficient, and the neural pathways show unusual development in the motor cortex." Vextar looked over her shoulder at the scanner displays. "What does it mean?" "This specimen evolved on a high-gravity world," Youthgal replied, making notes on her data pad. "Significantly higher than standard galactic norm. The bone density is nearly 30% greater than our projections for baseline humans, and the muscle mass ratio suggests adaptation to crushing gravitational forces." For the first time since his capture, Morrison allowed himself a small smile. "You might say that." The comment drew Vextar's attention immediately. "You find something amusing, mammal?" "Just thinking about home," Morrison replied casually. Titan Colony was beautiful this time of year. The methane storms had cleared, and you could see Saturn's rings through the atmospheric processors. Youthgal's head snapped up from her instruments. "Titan Colony? That's impossible. Our intelligence reports indicated that settlement was destroyed 6 months ago." "The orbital stations were destroyed," Morrison corrected, his tone conversational. "The underground cities, well, that's a different story entirely." The two Zephyrians exchanged glances. Titan Colony had been one of humanity's most remote settlements, established on Saturn's largest moon despite the crushing 1.4 G gravity field. The colonists who had volunteered for that posting were considered either desperate or insane by most human standards. "The children born there were different," Morrison continued, flexing his fingers against the restraints in what appeared to be a nervous gesture. In reality, he was testing the give in the duranium bonds, feeling for stress points and weaknesses. Stronger, faster, more resilient. Had to be, really. Titan doesn't forgive weakness. Vextar's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You're trying to intimidate us with stories, human. Your tricks won't work." Morrison shrugged as much as the restraints allowed. "Not trying to intimidate anyone. Just making conversation. Gets lonely in that cell, you know?" But the damage was done. Youthgal was already running new scans, her scientific curiosity overriding the interrogation protocol. The readings she was getting didn't match anything in the Zephyrian databases on human physiology. This specimen was an anomaly, possibly a dangerous one. On the third day, they showed him recordings of the massacre at New Geneva Station. Morrison watched in silence as Zephyrian Marines executed human civilians, including women and children who had tried to surrender. His brother's wife and daughter had been on that station, visiting relatives when the attack came. "Still nothing to say?" Vextar taunted, studying Morrison's face for any sign of breaking. "Perhaps you need more motivation." The holographic display shifted to show intelligence reports on remaining human colonies. Target lists, extermination schedules. The systematic genocide of an entire species, planned with clinical efficiency. Morrison memorized every detail, every world marked for destruction, every timeline and fleet deployment. If he escaped, when he escaped, this information could save millions of lives. You know what I find interesting about your species? Morrison said finally, breaking hours of silence. Vextar leaned forward eagerly. What? You've conquered 17 different species, but you've never faced anything like us. Morrison's voice was calm, almost conversational. Every species you've defeated evolved on worlds with standard gravity, standard atmospheric pressure, standard everything. You've never encountered a Death World species before. Death World. Youth Gal looked up from her instruments, intrigued despite herself. Morrison smiled, and for the first time, both Zephyrians felt a chill of unease. Earth barely qualifies as a death world, and we've already given you more trouble than any species in your history. But Titan, he chuckled softly. Titan makes Earth look like a vacation resort. The interrogation continued, but the dynamic had shifted. The predator was still circling, but now it wasn't sure what kind of prey it had caught. The breakthrough came during Morrison's 4th night in captivity. He had been lying on the metal bench that served as his bed, pretending to sleep while actually listening to the guard conversations outside his cell. The Zephyrians, like most predator species, were naturally boastful when they thought their prey couldn't understand them. Unfortunately for them, Morrison had spent years studying their language during his intelligence training. 2 guards were discussing the ship's destination with casual cruelty that made Morrison's blood run cold. They were bound for Research Station Omega-7, a classified Zephyrian facility in the Arcturus system where captured humans were subjected to horrific medical experiments. The scientists there were particularly interested in studying human pain responses and regenerative capabilities. I heard they keep some specimens alive for months, one guard chittered in their harsh language, cutting pieces off and watching them grow back. The screaming gets tiresome after a while, the other replied with bored indifference. But the data is valuable for developing more efficient torture methods. Morrison's jaw clenched involuntarily, but he forced himself to remain still. He'd suspected this was their destination, but hearing it confirmed made the situation real in a way that abstract fear never could. He would be vivisected, his organs studied while he was still conscious, his brain probed and dissected until there was nothing left but agony and madness. The guards moved on, their conversation shifting to complaints about duty rotations and the quality of the ship's food dispensers. Morrison opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling of his cell, his mind racing through possibilities. He had perhaps 72 hours before they reached the research station. After that, escape would become impossible. The next evening brought a new humiliation. Subcommander Vextar arrived at his cell accompanied by a group of junior officers, their scales gleaming under the corridor's harsh lighting. They were young Zephyrians, barely out of the military academies on their homeworld, eager to advance their careers through humanity's extermination. "Gather around," Vextar announced with theatrical flair, gesturing toward Morrison's cell like a ringmaster presenting a circus act. "I want you all to observe this creature carefully. This is what the humans call their elite soldiers, their finest warriors bred for combat and reconnaissance." The junior officers pressed closer, their golden eyes bright with curiosity and contempt. Morrison remained seated on his bench, apparently lost in thought, but actually cataloging each face and voice for future reference. These weren't hardened veterans like Vextar. They were youngsters drunk on propaganda and their species' supposed superiority. "Notice how it cowers in its cage," Vextar continued, warming to his role as educator and tormentor. "Too weak even to protest its fate." The humans claimed their military was elite, trained from birth for warfare. Yet here sits their commander, as helpless as a newborn grub. The young officers laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with grinding metal. Their amusement was genuine. They truly believed they were looking at a broken, defeated creature. One of them, his scales still showing the bright patterns of adolescence, stepped closer to the force field. I heard humans are so fragile they break their own bones just from running, the youth said, his voice dripping with disdain. Is this true, pet? Do you shatter like glass when you try to move too quickly? Another junior officer, emboldened by his colleague's example, added his own mockery. Perhaps we should put it in with the Krillian pitworms when we reach the research station. At least then its death would provide some entertainment value. Oh, but that would be wasteful, chimed in a third voice, this one belonging to a female with particularly vibrant scale patterns. The scientists want to study how long human neural tissue can survive without a circulatory system. They're planning to remove its limbs one by one while keeping the brain alive. The group erupted in renewed laughter at this prospect. To them, Morrison wasn't a sentient being worthy of respect or even basic dignity. He was nothing more than a laboratory specimen, a curiosity to be poked and prodded until it stopped moving. Morrison stood slowly, his movement causing a brief lull in the mockery as the Zephyrians watched him with predatory interest. He walked to the force field with measured steps, each footfall deliberate and controlled. When he reached the energy barrier, he placed his right hand against it, palm flat against the humming blue surface. The sight of the human touching his cage like a confused animal sent the junior officers into fresh paroxysms of laughter. Here was proof of everything they'd been taught about the inferior mammalian species. Too stupid to understand that the force field was impenetrable, too primitive to accept the hopelessness of its situation. "Look at it!" gasped one of the youngsters, clutching his sides with mirth. "It thinks it can push through the barrier with its little paws." "Someone should record this," suggested another. "The propaganda ministry would love footage of human stupidity for the recruitment broadcasts." Morrison studied their faces through the force field, memorizing every detail while they continued their performance. These weren't the calculating predators he'd faced during interrogation. These were children playing with what they thought was a helpless toy. Their arrogance would be their undoing. "Tell me something," Morrison said quietly, his voice cutting through their laughter like a blade through silk. The sudden speech from their pet caught them off guard, and the corridor fell silent except for the hum of the ship's engines. Vextar's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What now, mammal?" More desperate pleas for mercy. "Just curious about something," Morrison replied, his tone conversational. "What's the gravity on your homeworld?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, catching the Zephyrians completely off guard. Several of the junior officers exchanged confused glances, unsure why their prisoner would ask such a random question. Vextar's forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air for deception. "What does it matter to a dead human?" Morrison shrugged, apparently unbothered by the casual death threat. "Just making conversation. I've been stuck in this cell for days with nothing to do but think. Humor me. What's Zephyria Prime's gravity compared to galactic standard?" 0.73 gravities, came the automatic response from Science Officer Youthgal, who had arrived during the gathering and now stood at the back of the group. Her scientific mind was compelled to provide accurate data, even when she couldn't understand the relevance of the question. Morrison nodded thoughtfully, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "Interesting. That explains a lot about your physiology, the hollow bones, the lean muscle structure, the way you move. You're adapted for low-gravity environments." "Your point being?" Vextar demanded, though something in the human's tone was beginning to make him uneasy. "Earth has 1.0 standard gravities," Morrison continued, still resting his hand against the force field. "But that's not where I'm from originally." He looked up at the assembled aliens, and for the first time since his capture, they saw something unsettling in his dark eyes, not fear or desperation, but calculation. Cold, patient calculation. "I'm from Titan Colony." The mockery died away like a candle flame in a hurricane. Even the youngest Zephyrians knew about Titan, Saturn's moon, where desperate human colonists had established settlements in crushing 1.4 G gravity fields. The children born there were said to be different, stronger, more resilient, more dangerous. But surely that was just human propaganda, wasn't it? The silence that followed Morrison's revelation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. The junior officers who had been laughing moments before now stood frozen, their golden eyes wide with uncertainty. Even Subcommander Vextar seemed momentarily at a loss for words, his forked tongue flicking nervously as he processed this unexpected information. Impossible, Vextar finally hissed, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. Titan colony was destroyed 6 months ago. Our long-range bombardment reduced the entire moon to rubble. Morrison's smile was cold and predatory, transforming his features into something that made the young Zephyrians instinctively step backward. The orbital stations were destroyed, he corrected, his voice carrying the patience of a teacher addressing particularly slow students. The surface installations, the atmospheric processors, the mining platforms, all gone. But the underground cities. He paused, letting the implications sink in. The underground cities were built to survive much worse than orbital bombardment. Science Officer Youthgal pushed through the crowd of junior officers, her scanner already active and humming as she took new readings. The device's display flickered with cascading data streams, and her scaled face grew increasingly pale as she studied the results. "Subcommander," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "I'm detecting anomalous readings from the prisoner. Bone density is 47% above baseline human norms. Muscle fiber density is... This can't be right. What is it?" Vextar demanded, moving to look over her shoulder at the scanner's display. "According to these readings, this specimen possesses approximately 3 times the muscular efficiency of a standard human," Youthgal whispered, her scientific mind struggling to process the implications. "The cardiovascular system shows adaptations I've never seen before: enlarged heart chambers, redundant circulatory pathways, blood with twice the oxygen-carrying capacity of normal hemoglobin." Morrison nodded approvingly, as if she were a promising student who had finally grasped a difficult concept. Titan Colony wasn't just a mining operation or a research station. It was an experiment in human adaptation. The first generation of colonists barely survived. The gravity was crushing, literally. Bones broke from simple movements. Hearts failed under the constant strain. But humans... He chuckled, and the sound made several of the younger Zephyrians flinch. "Humans are remarkably adaptable creatures." He began to pace within his cell, and for the first time, the watching aliens noticed something unsettling about his movements. Despite being confined in what should have been a cramped space, Morrison moved with fluid grace, each step perfectly controlled and balanced. There was no wasted motion, no inefficiency, just predatory elegance that spoke of perfect physical conditioning. "The second generation did better," Morrison continued conversationally. "Stronger bones, more efficient hearts, improved lung capacity. By the third generation, my generation, we weren't just surviving in 1.4G. We were thriving. Do you know what it's like? Growing up where every step is a workout? Where every movement builds muscle? Where gravity itself tries to crush you every moment of every day?" Vextar was backing away from the cell now, his predatory instincts finally recognizing what his rational mind had been too arrogant to accept. "You're trying to intimidate us with stories, human. Atmospheric tall tales won't save you." "Stories?" Morrison stopped pacing and fixed the subcommander with a stare that could have frozen plasma. "Let me tell you about atmospheric pressure differentials, Vextar. Titan's atmosphere is 1.5 times denser than Earth normal, with a surface pressure of 1.45 atmospheres. We didn't just adapt to the gravity. We adapted to crushing atmospheric pressure that would burst the lungs of most galactic species." Youthgal's scanner was beeping frantically now, its readings climbing into ranges she had never seen in any biological specimen. "Subcommander, the lung capacity measurements are off the charts. This creature could survive in vacuum for extended periods. And the neural pathway development." She looked up from her instrument, her face a mask of scientific fascination mixed with growing dread. "The reflexes are enhanced beyond anything in our databases." "But here's the really interesting part," Morrison said, rolling his shoulders in what appeared to be a casual stretch. The movement was deceptively simple, but every Zephyrian in the corridor could see the play of muscles beneath his uniform: dense, corded muscle that spoke of incredible physical power held in perfect check. "Your ship runs at standard galactic artificial gravity," he continued, his tone still conversational despite the growing tension in the air. 0.8 g, just like most vessels in civilized space. For you, that's normal. For most species, it's comfortable. For me, his smile widened, revealing teeth that suddenly seemed far too sharp for a supposedly herbivorous species. For me, it's like being on a low-gravity vacation. The youngest of the junior officers, the one who had mocked human fragility, stumbled backward and collided with the corridor wall. His scales had gone pale with terror as his primitive brain finally understood what they were looking at. This wasn't a helpless prisoner. This was an apex predator from a world that would kill any of them within minutes of exposure. Morrison placed both hands against the force field now, pressing his palms flat against the energy barrier. The humming of the containment field seemed to intensify, as if it were straining against some unseen pressure. "You want to know something else about physics?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried clearly through the corridor. "Force fields are designed to contain creatures of normal strength operating under normal gravity. They're energy barriers, not structural supports." Vextar's hand dropped to his sidearm, but his movements seemed sluggish compared to the fluid precision of the human before him. "Impossible. The containment system is rated for creatures 10 times your mass." "Mass isn't the same as strength," Morrison replied, his dark eyes fixed on the subcommander with uncomfortable intensity. "And strength isn't the same as leverage. Your engineers designed this system to hold large, slow creatures, not small, dense, incredibly strong ones who understand exactly where the stress points are." The force field flickered. It was barely perceptible, lasting less than a second, but every being in the corridor saw it. The blue energy barrier that had seemed so solid and permanent suddenly looked fragile, inadequate. "You see," Morrison said, his voice now carrying an edge of barely restrained violence, "there's something your intelligence reports got wrong about humans. We're not just from a high-gravity world. We're from a world that spent 4 billion years trying to kill everything that lived on it. Predators, diseases, natural disasters, climate shifts that could wipe out entire species overnight." He leaned closer to the force field, and the energy barrier flickered again, more noticeably this time. "Everything that survived on Earth had to be tough, adaptable, and mean enough to kill anything that threatened it. And humans." Morrison's smile was no longer remotely human. It was the expression of a creature that had clawed its way to the top of the most vicious food chain in the galaxy. "Humans didn't just survive. We won." The force field failed with a shower of sparks and the acrid smell of burned circuitry. In the sudden darkness that followed, the only sound was Jake Morrison's quiet, deadly laughter. In the split second of darkness that followed the force field's failure, Morrison's mind shifted into the cold, calculating mode that had kept him alive through dozens of combat missions. Time seemed to slow as his enhanced reflexes, honed by a lifetime in crushing gravity, processed the tactical situation with machine-like precision. The emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the corridor in hellish red illumination. The young Zephyrian officer who had mocked human fragility was closest to the cell entrance, his golden eyes wide with shock as he stared at the sparking remains of the containment system. He was reaching for his sidearm with movements that seemed glacially slow to Morrison's accelerated perception. Morrison had been calculating this moment for 4 days, measuring distances, analyzing angles, studying the biomechanics of Zephyrian physiology. He'd identified every weakness in their reptilian anatomy: the vulnerable throat cartilage, the brittle bone structure adapted for low gravity, the slower neural response times of cold-blooded creatures. The first kill was almost anticlimactic. Morrison exploded from the cell like a missile launched from a railgun, his body moving with the fluid precision of a predator evolved on a world where hesitation meant death. His right fist, driven by muscles that had been forged in 1.4 g and were now operating in less than 0.8 g, struck the young officer's chest with the force of a pneumatic hammer. The sound was wet and final, the crack of ribs shattering, the wet pop of internal organs rupturing under impossible pressure. The Zephyrian's body folded around Morrison's fist like paper around a rock, and he flew backward into the corridor wall with enough force to leave a spider web of cracks in the duranium plating. The other junior officers scattered like startled birds, their training deserting them in the face of something that shouldn't have been possible. These were beings who had been raised on stories of Zephyrian superiority, who had been taught that alien species were weak, slow, and easily conquered. The sight of their comrade being killed by a single punch from a supposedly helpless prisoner shattered their worldview in an instant. Subcommander Vextar was faster than his subordinates, his combat experience overriding his shock. His plasma pistol cleared its holster with practiced efficiency, the weapon's targeting system already locking onto Morrison's center mass. But Morrison had anticipated this response, had studied the Zephyrian's movements during the interrogations, had noted the slight favoring of his left side that suggested an old injury. In the reduced gravity, Morrison moved like liquid lightning. He dove low and to the right, using the dead officer's body as a springboard to launch himself at Vextar. The subcommander's shot went wide, scorching the wall where Morrison had been a microsecond earlier. Morrison's left hand closed around Vextar's wrist with crushing force, and the alien's confident expression transformed into a mask of agony as the bones in his forearms snapped like dry twigs. The plasma pistol tumbled from nerveless fingers, clattering across the deck plating. "Impossible," Vextar gasped, his professional composure finally cracking as he stared into Morrison's dark eyes. You're just human." Morrison's grip tightened, and Vextar screamed as more bones broke. "Just human," Morrison repeated, his voice carrying the cold fury of a species that had endured genocide attempts, torture, and systematic extermination. "Let me tell you what just human means, you reptilian bastard." With his free hand, Morrison grabbed the plasma pistol from the deck. His fingers found the weapon's power cell release, and he ejected the energy pack with practiced ease. The cylindrical battery was no larger than his thumb, but it contained enough concentrated energy to power a military-grade weapon for hours. "It means we evolved on a world where everything, the weather, the geology, the biology, even the physics, was actively trying to kill us every single day," Morrison said conversationally, even as he applied steady pressure to the power cell with his bare fingers. "It means we spent 4 billion years learning how to survive impossible odds." The power cell's casing began to crack under the pressure. Vextar's eyes widened as he realized what Morrison was doing. The energy contained in that small cylinder could level half the corridor if it was deliberately overloaded. "It means we learned to use our enemies' own weapons against them," Morrison continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone even as Vextar writhed in agony. "And most importantly," the power cell shattered in Morrison's grip, but instead of exploding, the energy discharged harmlessly through his fingers in a cascade of blue sparks. The sight was impossible. No known species could safely channel that much raw energy through biological tissue. "It means we don't break as easily as you think." Morrison released Vextar's ruined arm and stepped back, allowing the subcommander to collapse to the deck in a writhing heap. The surviving junior officers pressed themselves against the corridor walls, too terrified to flee, too shocked to fight. Science Officer Youthgal stood frozen in the corridor's far end, her scanner clutched in her trembling hands. The device was screaming warnings about radiation levels, energy discharges, and biological readings that didn't match anything in the Zephyrian scientific databases. "How?" she whispered, her scientific mind struggling to process what she had witnessed. "The energy discharge alone should have killed you. No biological organism can channel that much power without cellular breakdown." Morrison flexed his fingers, examining them as if checking for damage. There wasn't so much as a burn mark on his skin. Titan colony wasn't just about adapting to gravity and atmospheric pressure, he explained with the patience of a teacher addressing a confused student. "The electromagnetic storms on Saturn's moon are some of the most intense in the solar system. Lightning strikes that would vaporize most creatures are just Tuesday afternoon weather on Titan." He looked up at the assembled Zephyrians, and his smile was the expression of an apex predator that had just remembered how much it enjoyed hunting. The children born there had to adapt to electrical discharges that would fry the nervous systems of most galactic species. Natural selection at its finest, Those who couldn't handle it died young. Those who survived. Morrison's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed far too sharp in the red emergency lighting. Those who survived became living lightning rods. The ship's alarm klaxons began to wail as damage reports flooded in from across the vessel. The destruction of the containment system had triggered a cascade failure in the local power grid, and several decks were now operating on emergency power only. Morrison had been counting on that. In the confusion that would follow, with damage control teams scrambling to restore systems and security forces trying to coordinate a response, one escaped prisoner might be able to move through the ship undetected. But first, he had to deal with the witnesses. "Now then," Morrison said, cracking his knuckles with sounds like small explosions, "let's discuss the terms of your surrender." The surviving Zephyrians looked at each other with growing horror as they realized that their nightmare was just beginning. What followed wasn't a fight in any conventional sense. It was a systematic demonstration of what 4 billion years of evolutionary pressure could produce when unleashed in an environment where it held every possible advantage. Morrison moved through the ship's corridors like a force of nature, each step calculated for maximum efficiency and lethality. The reduced gravity that felt normal to the Zephyrians was like a performance enhancer to someone born in Titan's crushing embrace. Every movement was amplified. Every strike carried 3 times the force it would have possessed on his homeworld. The first security team arrived within minutes, their heavy combat boots echoing through the corridors as they rushed toward the containment level. They were professionals, veterans of a dozen conquest campaigns, armed with military-grade plasma rifles and wearing full tactical armor. Against any other escaped prisoner, they would have been overwhelming force. Against Jake Morrison, they were target practice. The lead soldier rounded the corner at a tactical sprint, his rifle already tracking toward the human's last known position. Morrison wasn't there. In the split second it took the Zephyrian's reptilian brain to process this information, Morrison dropped from the ceiling where he had been waiting, pressed flat against the overhead like a spider. The soldier's neck snapped with a sound like breaking celery. Morrison relieved the corpse of its weapon before it hit the deck, his fingers instantly finding the rifle's controls despite having never handled this particular model before. Weapons were weapons, and Morrison had been trained to use any tool that could kill. The second soldier in the squad managed to get off a shot, but Morrison was already moving. The plasma bolt seared the air where he had been, leaving a glowing crater in the bulkhead. Morrison's return fire was more accurate. The Zephyrian's head simply ceased to exist, vaporized by his own weapon turned against him. The remaining 3 soldiers tried to establish a defensive position at the corridor junction, using their armor and numbers to their advantage. It might have worked against a conventional opponent who thought in conventional terms. Morrison didn't think conventionally. He put his fist through the deck plating. The reinforced metal that formed the ship's infrastructure was designed to withstand the stresses of hyperspace travel and the occasional meteor impact. It was not designed to withstand the focus pressure of a Titan-born human's punch delivered with surgical precision at the joint between 2 support beams. Morrison tore a meter-wide hole in the deck and dropped through to the level below, leaving the soldiers guarding an empty corridor while he flanked them through the ship's own structure. The ventilation system that had been designed for the Zephyrians' lean physiques was more than adequate for a human, even one of Morrison's enhanced build. 5 minutes later, he emerged from a maintenance hatch behind the defensive position. The soldiers died without ever seeing him coming, their armor no protection against strikes delivered with enough force to crack battleship hull plating. Morrison appropriated their equipment methodically: ammunition, grenades, a portable scanner that would help him navigate the ship's layout. He was no longer just an escaped prisoner. He was a one-man army operating in enemy territory, and he intended to make the most of his tactical advantages. The ship's communication system crackled to life as Captain Krelvex's voice echoed through the corridors. "All hands, we have a Code 7 containment breach. The human prisoner has escaped and is considered extremely dangerous. Security teams Alpha through Delta converge on Deck 7. Authorization is given for lethal force." Morrison smiled as he listened to the announcement. Lethal force was exactly what he had been hoping for. The rules of engagement had just changed from capture the prisoner to kill the monster. which meant he no longer had to hold back. A squad of Marines found him in the ship's armory 10 minutes later. They had come prepared for a desperate human armed with stolen weapons, possibly barricaded behind improvised defenses. What they found was something far worse. Morrison had been busy during those 10 minutes. The armory's security locks were designed to prevent unauthorized access to military weapons, but they were electronic locks, and Morrison had learned something interesting about Zephyrian electronics during his escape. They were remarkably vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse. The same electrical resistance that had allowed him to safely discharge a plasma weapons power cell could be weaponized in other ways. A controlled surge through the lock circuits had fried the security system completely, giving him access to enough firepower to outfit a small army. When the Marines breached the armory, they found Morrison waiting for them behind a heavy plasma cannon that should have required a 3-person crew to operate. The weapon's targeting system had been removed entirely. Morrison was aiming it manually, using calculations performed in his head with the precision of a computer. The first shot vaporized the point man and left a molten crater in the corridor wall behind him. The second shot took out the entire squad leader and 2 Marines who had been using him for cover. The remaining soldiers tried to retreat, but Morrison had already acquired new targets. By the time the firing stopped, the corridor looked like the inside of a furnace. Molten metal dripped from the walls, and the air shimmered with residual heat. Morrison stepped over the cooling remains of his enemies and continued deeper into the ship, dragging the plasma cannon behind him like a favored hunting rifle. The ship's internal sensors tracked his progress with growing alarm. Every security checkpoint he encountered was systematically destroyed. Every defensive position was overrun with casual efficiency. The human moved through their vessel like a plague, leaving nothing but death and destruction in his wake. Captain Krelvex watched the carnage unfold from his command center, his scaled hands trembling as he realized what they had awakened. This wasn't an escaped prisoner. This was an apex predator that had been caged and tormented until it remembered what it truly was. "Sir," his communications officer reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We've lost contact with security teams Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. Delta team is requesting immediate evacuation." Krelvex stared at the tactical display showing Morrison's position moving steadily toward the bridge. Red warning icons marked the locations of destroyed security stations, disabled defensive systems, and dead crew members. The human was carving a path of absolute destruction through the heart of his ship. "How many?" the captain asked quietly. "Sir, how many crew members has it killed?" The communications officer checked his reports, his face growing paler with each update. 47 confirmed casualties, sir. And counting." Krelvex closed his eyes and felt the weight of his species' arrogance settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. They had captured what they thought was a helpless prisoner. Instead, they had brought a weapon of mass destruction aboard their ship and given it every reason to hate them. Now that weapon was coming for him, and there was nowhere left to run. "Lock down the bridge," he ordered, though he knew it wouldn't matter. If the human could tear through military-grade security like tissue paper, a few more blast doors wouldn't even slow him down. "And send a message to High Command," Krelvex added, his voice hollow with the certainty of approaching doom. "Tell them we were wrong about the humans. Tell them we were wrong about everything." In the distance, the sound of tearing metal echoed through the ship like the footsteps of an approaching god of war. The bridge doors had been sealed with emergency locks, reinforced blast shutters, and every defensive measure the Zephyrian military had ever devised. Captain Krelvex stood behind the command console, his ceremonial sword drawn in a final gesture of defiance, while his remaining bridge crew huddled at their stations with the desperate hope that their technology might somehow protect them. It took Morrison exactly 47 seconds to tear through all of it. The blast doors, designed to withstand direct hits from capital ship weapons, crumpled like aluminum foil under his enhanced strength. The emergency barriers that could stop a charging Krillian battle beast shattered into fragments that scattered across the bridge like deadly confetti. And the automated defense turrets that should have cut down any intruder were simply ripped from their mountings and hurled aside like annoying toys. Morrison stepped through the ruined entrance with the casual confidence of a man taking a leisurely stroll. His stolen uniform was torn and stained with alien blood, and the heavy plasma cannon he dragged behind him left glowing scratches in the deck plating. But his dark eyes were clear and focused, burning with the cold fury of a species that had endured too much and finally decided to push back. "Captain Krelvex," Morrison said conversationally, as if greeting an old friend. "We need to talk." The bridge crew scrambled for weapons, but Morrison's presence seemed to fill the entire space with an aura of barely contained violence. These were beings who had spent their careers conquering helpless species, who had grown comfortable with their technological superiority. Faced with something that could tear apart their defenses with its bare hands, they discovered that courage was a finite resource. Krelvex raised his ceremonial sword with hands that trembled only slightly. "You want to kill me, human? Then do it. But know that my death will change nothing. The Empire has already marked your species for extinction." Morrison considered this for a moment, then nodded thoughtfully. "You're probably right, which is why I'm not going to kill you. Not yet." The captain's confusion was evident in his reptilian features. "What? I'm going to give you a choice," Morrison replied, settling into the ship's communication console with practiced ease. His fingers danced across the alien controls as if he had been using Zephyrian technology his entire life. "You can die here, right now, knowing that your species learned nothing from this encounter. Or you can live long enough to deliver a message." Morrison's hands never stopped moving as he spoke, activating communication arrays, bypassing security protocols, and accessing the ship's quantum transmission systems. Within minutes, he had established a direct link to every Zephyrian vessel in the fleet, as well as a hyperspace relay that would carry his signal all the way back to Zephyria Prime. "Impossible," whispered the ship's communications officer. "Those systems are encrypted with quantum entanglement locks. No alien species has ever been able to." Titan Colony had the best technical schools in human space, Morrison interrupted without looking up from his work. "When you're living on a moon that actively tries to kill you every day, you learn to master every piece of technology that might keep you alive, including communications equipment salvaged from a dozen different alien species." He finished his preparations and activated the ship-wide broadcast system. Every Zephyrian vessel within 50 light-years would receive this transmission in real time. More importantly, the message would be relayed back to High Command, where it would be analyzed, debated, and ultimately understood by those with the power to make strategic decisions. Morrison looked directly into the main communication pickup, his scarred face filling the screen with an image that would haunt Zephyrian nightmares for generations to come. "This is Commander Jake Morrison, Titan Colonial Marines, speaking to the Zephyrian Empire and any other species considering humanity's extermination," he began, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had just proven his point in the most direct way possible. "Today, one human, just one, has killed 93 of your crew members and systematically destroyed a state-of-the-art dreadnought using nothing but superior training, enhanced physiology, and the weapons you provided. I want you to think about what this means." Morrison paused, letting his words sink in while the camera continued to broadcast his image across the galaxy. Behind him, the ruined bridge served as a perfect backdrop to his message, a testament to what happened when you underestimated humanity. "You've been operating under the assumption that humans are weak, frightened creatures who will submit to superior technology and firepower. You've convinced yourselves that we're just another primitive species to be conquered and enslaved. You are catastrophically wrong." He leaned forward, his dark eyes burning with the intensity of a star going supernova. "Humans evolved on a world that spent 4 billion years trying to kill everything that lived on it. We survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, and predators that make your worst nightmares look like children's toys. We didn't just survive. We thrived, we adapted, and we spread across the most hostile environments our solar system could provide." Morrison gestured toward the carnage around him, the broken bodies and shattered technology that had once represented the pinnacle of Zephyrian military might. "The colonies you've destroyed were just the beginning of our expansion. The fleets you've engaged were just our scouting forces. The resistance you've encountered so far represents maybe 1% of humanity's true potential. And now you've done something incredibly stupid, You've given us a reason to get serious. The transmission quality flickered as the ship's damaged system struggled to maintain the connection, but Morrison's voice never wavered. I'm sending the coordinates of every Zephyrian fleet position, supply depot, and strategic facility that this ship's computers contain. By the time you receive this message, human strike forces will already be en route to each location. We're not interested in negotiation, tribute, or conditional surrender. We're going to systematically dismantle your empire until you no longer pose a threat to any human world. Morrison stood, his enhanced physiology allowing him to move with fluid grace despite the ship's increasing structural instability. The dreadnought was dying around him, its systems failing as the damage from his rampage cascaded through the vessel's infrastructure. But here's the thing about humans that your intelligence reports missed, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. We're not just fighters, we're teachers, and we're going to teach the entire galaxy what happens when you threaten our children. Behind him, Captain Krelvex finally found his voice. You're insane. Even if everything you claim is true, you'll never escape this ship alive. You'll die here with the rest of us. Morrison turned back to the captain with a smile that would have frozen the blood of any Earth predator. Who said anything about escaping? He activated the ship's self-destruct sequence with the same casual efficiency he had used to kill the crew. Warning klaxons began to wail as the dreadnought's fusion reactors started their final countdown. Morrison had exactly 6 minutes to reach the escape pod bay. More than enough time for someone who could move like liquid lightning through a ship he had already mapped in his mind. Remember this moment, Morrison said into the pickup, his final words to the Zephyrian Empire and any other species listening. Remember that one human did this to you, and remember that there are 8 billion more of us, and we're all getting very tired of being underestimated. The transmission cut to static as Morrison destroyed the communication console with a single devastating punch. Then he was moving, flowing through the dying ship like a ghost, leaving Captain Krelvex and his bridge crew to contemplate their final moments aboard a vessel that had become a monument to their species' fatal arrogance. 5 minutes later, the escape pod jettisoned just as the dreadnought's fusion reactors achieved critical mass. The explosion lit up space for light years in every direction, a brief new star that announced to the galaxy that humanity was no longer content to be the hunted. From his escape pod, Morrison watched the fireball expand and smiled. The message had been sent, and soon the real war would begin. The Zephyrians had awakened something they didn't understand, something that had crawled out of the gravity well of a death world, and decided it was time to remind the galaxy why Earth's children were not to be trifled with. Humanity was done being mocked, and the universe was about to learn what that meant.